مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لم تعلن النتيجة رسميا، ولكن بعد 4 أعوام من فوز الرئيس ترامب المذهل يبدو أننا سيكون لنا رئيس جديد نائب الرئيس السابق جو بايدن. ورغم ذلك في بعض الولايات ما يزال إخساء الأصوات مستمرا. انتقلت الحملة من التجمعات الانتخابية الكبيرة والإعلانات التلفزيونية إلى قاعات المحاكم في الولايات الحاسمة المهمة في طول البلد وأرضها. ماذا نعرف؟ إلى أي مدى تفوق جو بايدن في الأداء على هيلاري كلينتون قبل 4 أعوام؟ إلى أي درجة أدار فيروس كورونا بحملة دونالد ترامب؟ هل ستنتقل السيطرة على مجلس الشيوخ من الجمهوريين إلى الديمقراطيين؟ لمطالعة النتائج المبكرة للانتخابات يسرني أن ينضم إلي صحفيين محترمين هما في الوقت نفسه من أذكى الخبراء السياسيين في واشنطن، ديفيد هوكينز وستيف كليمنز. Well, we should have expected it. In this crazy topsy-turvy roller coaster year, we have a crazy topsy-turvy roller coaster election. Not every state has finally reported their ultimate count. There's still counting to be done. And so what do we know? I'm delighted to welcome Steve Clemons and David Hawkins to fill us in on what we know about the 2020 presidential election. Gentlemen, a record turnout. Who, where, and when? David, let's begin with you.
Who, where, and when turned out? Gosh. Well, so to remind the viewers, the U.S. election this year was conducted in a different way than ever before. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, we opened up more early. We opened up the period for the election for essentially as long as a month, with people invited to either go to polling places early so they could take their time and spread out, or return their ballots by mail. And 101 million people, way more than ever before, voted ahead of Election Day. And many of those votes went for the Democrats because the president had sown doubt about the validity of this sort of somewhat innovative, somewhat old school election system. But then another amazing thing happened, and perhaps as many as 60 million more people turned out on Election Day. So it was an enormous turnout. It was huge in places that favored the president, very big in rural America, but solid everywhere.
So, and Steve, what does this tell us? These two great phenomenon about early voting and this amazing turnout on Election Day.
Well, what it tells you is that people are very engaged. They feel that this is an inflection point in the choices for the country, and that there are two, as we've all been saying, there are two different Americas living within the same geographic space, and they have very, very different views about the leadership and direction of the country. I mean, there is a very clear contrast in the views and direction between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and you saw them get enormous numbers of supporters in both of those camps. David's exactly right. This is the largest turnout in a century. And so people are engaged, and both sides, got their people to come out.
I think it's important to point out that President Trump actually attracted approximately 6 million more voters than he had 4 years ago. About 10% of his vote are people who didn't even vote for him last time. What does that say to us?
Well, I think at a minimum, it says that, I'm sorry, at a minimum, it says this was in no way, no matter how, in the end, it will be a tight outcome. Even if the president loses re-election, this will in no way amount to a repudiation of Trump or Trumpism. Because as you said, he got 10% more human beings voting for him this time than last time. The sort of conventional wisdom of the last 4 years has been the president has his very, very passionate base of support, but he's never grown it. Well, he grew it somehow. Either those people weren't telling us the truth for the past 4 years, or he found new people to vote for him.
And Steve, what's your interpretation?
Well, I agree 1,000% with David that this is shows that there's no repudiation of Trump by his base, despite what many people thought was very poor management of the COVID crisis, despite bungling on military fronts, on issues related to the economy. But it does show that COVID has faded as being the fundamental central issue for a lot of Americans. I think the thinking of the Biden camp was say as little as possible, do as little as possible, keep the attention focused on COVID and the trauma that 230,000 Americans dying means for the American electorate. So they didn't define themselves as much as they might in other places. And Donald Trump basically was able to move beyond that. And the one thing that continued to come through in these polls, which maybe need to be looked at in a very different ways, because the polls certainly got it wrong. But the one thing that came out consistently is how Donald Trump beats Joe Biden consistently on the economy. And when CNN did its first exit polls nationwide about what people, what drove their vote, what really stood out to me was that the number one issue was not COVID, it was how the economy might be managed. And that sent a real signal that we might see a surprise.
So, but if Donald Trump did a lot better than one might have expected, Joe Biden did a lot better than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. Isn't that also true?
Well, that is also true, but it always matters, where did he do better? How did he do better? He didn't do better in South Florida. He didn't do better with Blacks and Hispanics in Florida in certain key races. In fact, if you look at the aggregate national level, despite the George Floyd protests, the issues that we've had over racial tensions in America, it looks as if Donald Trump won about 4 or 5 percentage points in the Black American community, which is astonishing given everything we've gone through in the last year. So he did, I think right now at the margins, while it's right that Biden did win a lot more voters and brought a lot more people into it, he didn't win in all of the same pockets to make this a landslide. So it is a very tight, will be a contested outcome, no doubt. But I think in that process, he didn't win everything in the right corners of the country. And that is the complexity of the electoral college system that we have.
David, one thing that we haven't heard from all the election analysis, at least I haven't heard it, is the phrase election security or foreign interference, the Russians or the Chinese, which was such a big issue 4 years ago. Is it an issue in this campaign?
Well, it certainly was an issue. Whether in the end we learn post-election that there was efforts at disinformation. I mean, what changed between 4 years ago and this year was that 4 years ago we had ample evidence that the Russians actually tried to hack into computer systems, hack into the election systems, voter registration databases. That was not their strategy this time. Their strategy this time was to sow disinformation. I don't think we know the full extent of what they tried and what things that we've seen in social media in recent days they got away with, but I'm sure it'll come out. But the one, as of election day, the only sort of palpable thing was there was millions of calls went out to voters around the country saying, stay safe and stay home. Not the message you want to hear on election day if you're trying to get out the vote.
Okay, when we come back after the break, I'm going to ask you what might come next for the two major candidates and about the impact of the presidential vote on the Senate and the House and everything else Americans were voting on in our elections this year. In just a moment. There's so much news out there. So many great newspapers and websites, so many fine journalists and writers, so many fascinating polls and surveys that it's impossible to keep up. Sometimes the flood of news is so overwhelming, you just want to skip a day or a week. But the tug of current events and the need to know what's happening draws you back in. How can you navigate all that news and all that opinion without drowning? The answer is to find a news curator or consolidator, a judicious, well-balanced team of experts you trust to gather the headlines, the op-eds, and graphic displays that really matter to keep you up to date and informed. That's why I turn to Real Clear Politics almost every day. It's a website that gathers everything I need to know about politics and the people who write about it in one easy to access place. So don't give up with all that news. Let www.realclearpolitics.com do the work for you. Our guests again today include Steve Clemons. Steve is the editor-at-large for The Hill, a newspaper focused on Congress and Capitol Hill. He is also a senior fellow and founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, a prominent Washington think tank. Steve has served as Washington editor-at-large for Atlantic Live, vice president of the Economic Strategy Institute, and executive director of the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. Also joining us today is David Hawkins. David has 25 years experience reporting on how Washington works, or doesn't work, as the case may be. Currently editor-in-chief of The Fulcrum, a news site covering American politics, he was formerly senior editor of CQ and Roll Call, two must-read newspapers covering Capitol Hill. And since both of you have such extensive Capitol Hill experience, let's turn to the congressional and Senate part of our 2020 election. What do we know about that, Steve?
Well, right now we know that it did not go the direction that many pollsters thought it would. And so I think polling is broken. A lot of fundraisers raised a lot of money to sort of further expand Nancy Pelosi's Democratic majority in the House. That looks like that got stopped, and Democrats may, at this point, even lose a few seats in the House. And of course, in the Senate, there were dreams and aspirations that, you know, the cut through the Republican majority could go all the way up to leader Mitch McConnell and take down other stalwarts like Lindsey Graham. But we know Lindsey Graham has won. Mitch McConnell has won. Susan Collins, who was on one of the most endangered lists from Maine, has won her seat. So in that case, it's very unlikely at this point that Democrats will take control of the Senate either. So this election and the turnout turned out to be a setback, despite lots of optical dimensions that look like they had a chance, because the Democrats certainly outraised the Republicans financially, and just about every poll, both conservative and liberal, was showing they would do much better than they did, but that didn't turn out.
David, what is it likely to mean to whatever new administration is going to be in the White House to have a Congress in which everything is tighter, a much closer, a smaller Democratic majority in the House and a much smaller Republican majority in the Senate, maybe a Democratic Senate, but likely a very, very tiny Republican majority? What does that mean for whoever is in the Oval Office?
Well, the easiest thing, sadly, to predict in this country is more gridlock than not. No matter what the precise balance of power is at the end, if as we're talking now, what one potential option is a narrow Biden presidency, a narrow Republican Senate. That would actually be the first time since the 19th century that a Democratic president has started his term with a Republican Senate. It has not happened, as I say, in 130 years, I believe.
Steve is a young man.
So what are we talking about there? We're talking about some very modest aspirations then for such a divided government. Efforts to put people back to work, which would be combined with efforts to bail the country out of the coronavirus pandemic, presumably would be something that all of Washington would want to get focused on right away. But beyond that, what you're mainly going to see, I think, is a lot of soul searching and infighting among the Democrats, even if Joe Biden is in the White House, about whether they have been too far to the center, too far to the left. There's going to be a lot of ideological soul searching among the Democrats, and not much happening legislatively in between.
So no chance that all these close votes actually trigger, God forbid, some bipartisanship and cooperation, a little bit more sanity, Steve?
Well, I think there's a possibility of that, in the sense that when you look at people like Senator Joe Manchin, who is in the most conservative wing of the Democratic Party, I know that Joe Manchin is out there right now with a group called No Labels saying, make sure that every vote is counted, working with Governor Larry Hogan, a more liberal wing of the Republican establishment, still chairman of the National Governors Association. So Republicans never trying to show that something is possible there. We also have to realize that, remember, even though they didn't come up with a COVID relief deal in the days before the election, Donald Trump was out there saying he wanted to spend more money than Nancy Pelosi, while a lot of people in his caucus didn't have. So there's a chance the middle can matter more. But I think David is fundamentally right in the end, that both parties are going to be stuck in this schizophrenic swirl where the dominant personality is going to continue to get clobbered inside the party as they struggle to define where that party goes. You have a big divide in the Democratic Party circle, and you're going to have a lot of finger pointing saying, wow, we should have run Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. It's going to be that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wing of the party that's going to demand, more strident positions. You're going to have the same thing in the Republican Party. Some regret that deal-making pragmatism in the center and want to have a harsher line with that. So both parties are going to be struggling with who and what they are, and that will, you'll have moments where the middle does matter. And so I won't write off the folks that are in there in the center trying to do something, because they'll have their day, but they won't have it for long until some of those posture on the side.
So there is, of course, a third branch of the American government, the judiciary. Usually we don't talk much about the judiciary when it comes to our elections, but that's not always the case. 2000, the Bush v. Gore election was settled by the Supreme Court. President Trump has said that he thinks there's fraud going on with some of our vote counting, even with a narrow, what seems to be perhaps a narrow Biden victory. Is this election going to end up in federal court, David?
Very likely it will end up in federal court. First of all, we should hasten to add that the president's claims of fraud are wholly not substantiated. There has been, as we're speaking now, there has been no credible evidence of any effort to steal votes, change the outcome of the elections, hide votes, none of that. The president is essentially fabricating this. He has focused his attention largely on Pennsylvania, a very large state in the American Northeast, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, two cities that many of our listeners may know about. It's a big state. It's about the fourth or fifth most populous state. They have had some strange rules there this year, some unusual rules. He seems to be wanting to focus on that. It may not matter because of this electoral college. He may not need, whether he fights and wins in Pennsylvania may not matter. Of course, if it does matter, then the ultimate resolution of this would be the Supreme Court of the United States, 9 justices, 3 of them named by Donald Trump, 1 of them put on the court by Donald Trump just in the last couple of weeks, Amy Coney Barrett.
Steve, what do you think Justice Barrett's position? Will she recuse herself from participating in decisions on this election, or is this likely to be a 9-vote decision, whatever happens on the Supreme Court on this election?
Well, I don't know what she's going to do, but I don't think she's going to recuse herself from this decision. And I think, Supreme Court justices are chosen for life, and they know, and she's confirmed for a lifetime job, and she knows that the world is watching. And I think, I have friends that are on the liberal persuasion that have think enormously highly of her legal credibility and her mind on these issues. And I have a hard time falling into the trap that just because someone named a justice to a court, that person owes, in this case, President Trump, a decision in his favor. I have a very hard time believing that virtually any justice, I could think of 1 or 2 in the Supreme Court, but any justice would really throw out hundreds of thousands of votes that were filed and filed under the legitimate rules of those states. There may be questions about the legitimacy of those rules later, but people voted along the terms that they were told to by those states. States control their own elections. They elect what are called electors, and those electors elect the president of the United States. And I think Donald Trump doesn't understand that system, and he's going to learn some of that perhaps from some of the justices he appointed.
Look, David Hawkins, Steve Clemons, thank you. I know this is a busy week, topsy-turvy roller coaster time. Thank you very much for joining us on Tackled Washington.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob.
It's finally over. This interminable campaign, the one that started the day after Donald Trump's stunning victory 4 years ago, has come to a close, with what looks like a record-setting turnout of voters finding a way to cast a ballot. For the first time in history, a majority, a surprisingly large majority, did this before Election Day, either through early voting in person, mailing in their ballot, or dropping them into official ballot boxes that cities, counties, and states set up in schools, churches, and community centers all across the country. The effort that millions of Americans made to vote, to have their voices heard, was truly inspirational. It almost drowned out all the negative stuff, the bullying, the insults, the intimidation, all part of a profoundly un-American effort to stop people from voting. Even without knowing the absolutely clear outcome, we know a lot. We know that the Republican Party became the party of Donald Trump, and its fortune in the Senate, the House, and even in key local elections was tied directly to the president's popularity and the success or failure of his own re-election effort. And we know that about 6 million people who didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016 did vote for him in this election. We know that the Democratic Party is far more diverse and even divided than ever before, with different and often warring ideological wings that are barely held together. But hold together they did, effectively and surprisingly so, given the party's history for self-destruction. And we know that Joe Biden did significantly better than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. We know that our country remains deeply divided, that somewhere around 45% of voters will follow Donald Trump through fire, whereas a little bit more were ashamed of the country that could choose Donald Trump as leader. And just to remind, in our constitutional system, 40 to 45% can win an election if they're in the right place. We know that certain norms that have held firm for decades have frayed. Norms about civility and public decorum. Norms about what information candidates owe voters and what is out of bounds. Norms about the role of the judiciary as an independent arbiter, untainted by political partisanship. Norms about the sanctity of the vote and the long, bumpy road to expand voting to as many Americans who would like to take part in our democratic system. In my view, I also think we know that our republic will endure, regardless of the outcome of this vote. Huge numbers of Americans will be despondent, depressed, even angry at whatever outcome there is. A small, noisy, crazed few may even turn violent. But I believe the vast majority of Americans will accept the outcome if it is achieved through transparency, fairness, justice, common sense, and the rule of law. I hope I'm right. I hope we rise to the challenge as a nation, as a democracy, as the United States. The world is watching. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الأيام الأخيرة من حملتنا الرئاسية الطويلة، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.